Hello, powerful people. Welcome back to the Power at Work blog. I'm Seth Harris. I'm a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change. Really delighted to have you here and so excited that you're going to get to see this blogcast with two of the heaviest hitters, two of the big hitters in labor reporting in our country. Josh Eidelson writes for Bloomberg and for Bloomberg Business Week. Dave Jamieson writes for the Huffington Post. They are as well connected, as extensively reported, as thorough, as thoughtful a reporter as you're going to find. They're just as thoughtful and smart and well connected as the reporters we had on our first Labor Reporters Roundtable a few weeks ago. By the way, after you watch this one, go back and take a look at that one. You'll get 6 really high quality reporters telling you what's going on in labor world. But today we have Dave and Josh, and we talked about some of the hot topics that are going on in labor right now. We recorded this Monday afternoon, late in the afternoon. The Teamsters and UPS are supposed to be negotiating. They walked away from the table and pointed fingers at one another. The strike deadline is a couple of weeks, 3 weeks down the line. Actually, literally 3 weeks from the day we're recording this. And we don't know how it's going to come out. You're going to hear us say that. But we didn't just talk about the Teamsters and UPS. We talked Amazon. We talked about Starbucks. We talked about other organizing. We did some predicting about what's going to happen going forward. Where would we be without all these outstanding labor reporters? That sadly, because of the shrinkage, the erosion in real, true, straightforward journalism in our country, murdered by social media, let me just say. Because of that erosion, we have so few reporters who really are spending all of their time focusing on worker issues, on worker power issues, on unions. There are some of them. There are some journals that cover labor very, very extensively, and you have really dedicated reporters like Dave and Josh and the reporters on our first roundtable who do this 24/7. There's just not enough focusing on it. There's not enough reporters out there. There's not enough news coming out. Now, what's ironic about saying that is I opened this blogcast by saying, wow, there's a lot of labor news right now. But I think that's more about the worker activism that we're seeing, the increased worker militancy, both in negotiating and in organizing all over the country, in industry after industry, surprising industries in some cases where workers are raising their hands up and saying, no. We're not going to allow the boss to tell us what to do anymore. We're going to come together and we're going to have a say, a voice in our workplace. So you're going to hear 2 expert analysts today talk about some of the most important issues in labor. We didn't cover them all. There's too much to talk about right now. But we're also eager to have you tell us what you would like to hear about. What blogcast would you like to see? So you can send us messages by connecting with us on social media. We're at Power at Work blog on Twitter. You better hurry because who knows how long Twitter is going to be around. We're on the competitor to Twitter, Threads. We've just opened up shop there at Power at Work blog. We're on Instagram at Power at Work blog there as well. We also are on LinkedIn. We have a Power at Work page there. If you're on LinkedIn, follow our page. But through any of those channels, send us a direct message and we will respond. We want to know what you want to hear. We have a sort of a limited format. We can't go out and do a major motion picture. You're not going to have superheroes flying in and special effects. But we'd like to talk about the topics that you would like us to talk about. So send us a message. We'd love to hear from you. I don't think I have a lot more to say. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to let you listen to Josh Eidelson and Dave Jamieson really educate us about what's going on in the labor world today. I'll see you. Hang around after. I have more to say to you, but stick around and watch this outstanding blogcast with Dave and Josh. Thanks. So I I've been doing this a long time. You both know that. I've been in and out, mostly in labor and employment law and policy for 4 decades now. And I can't remember a time during those 40 or so years when there have been as many important labor stories all happening at the same time. Right. And I'll list a few. You all know what they are, but let me just list a few of them. So we have the Teamsters and the UPS. They're 3 weeks away from a contract deadline or their contract expiration. They've walked away from the table. They're each pointing fingers at one another. And if they do strike, if the Teamsters do strike, it will be the largest private sector strike, maybe since the last Teamsters strike back in 1997. So that's one story. In Hollywood, the Writers Guild of America is on strike. The actors, and let me say that strike I think is in week 9, something like that, maybe more, maybe week 10 at this point. And the actors are right behind them. The actors are right now in negotiations with the same TV producers, TV and film producers. So you may have, SAG-AFTRA's already walking the picket line with the Writers Guild in support of the Writers Guild, but they may have their own picket line set up. You have brand name companies that you guys are covering, Starbucks, Amazon, some people would throw Apple into the mix, that are engaged in what I would describe as fairly naked union busting activities and repeatedly getting slapped down by the NLRB. I feel like I read a story by one or both of you about that every week nowadays. And there have been some big wins lately in contract talks. For example, the manufacturing facility for Spirit Aero Systems in Kansas, 6,000 machinists got a contract there. There have been some organizing victories. There's the Bluebird bus manufacturing plant in Georgia, the electric bus company that's going to be funded out of the president's Inflation Reduction Act. So Josh, let me start with you on this. What is the biggest and most important story that's going on right now? Or is the biggest and most important story the meta story that there's all of this activity going on right now?
Well, one of the biggest, most important stories happening this year, in my view, is this question of whether there will be first contracts that make significant gains at some of these brand name companies that were union free for decades, and where we saw over the past year and a half these stunning wins. As you mentioned, Starbucks, Amazon, Apple, Chipotle. There was a long period where some seasoned veteran union organizers came to the view that at the most powerful, prominent companies in the key non-union industries, it wasn't really viable to use an NLRB election as a way to unionize if you didn't already have a foothold or have an agreement with the company. And one of the reasons that unions, in some cases, moved towards these comprehensive or corporate campaign pressure tactics and away from NLRB elections in these situations was the sense that it wasn't viable to win the election. We've seen now in a number of cases, people can and do win those elections. The other reason, though, that some organizers have been wary about this NLRB process is the question of how do you get a contract? An advantage of pressuring a company into making a deal with you that makes it easier for people to unionize is at that point, the company to some extent has already made peace with the fact that a union will exist. And if you win the NLRB election, but you don't have some kind of agreement already, as various law professors will tell you, generally the penalty for not bargaining in good faith is being told you have to bargain in good faith. And in each of these campaigns, we see workers and union organizers grappling with the question of what is the leverage that's going to win a contract, and how do you make sure it's a contract that is good enough from the workers' perspective that it will encourage more organizing rather than chill it. And that is in many ways the central question this year, I think, even as we see these huge and potentially huge strikes unfolding at places that have been organized much longer, because of course the unionized share of the workforce in the US is a small island. And the bigger question is whether there's a path for that to change.
Yeah. So let me, I want to get to Dave in just a second, but I want to ask you a question, and Josh. So is it your sense that unions have somehow cracked the code on how to organize in these previously unorganized industries? Or is it just selective activism? Or, in the case of Starbucks, you had sort of uh, a surprise huge victory in 3 stores up in Buffalo. And then that set a prairie fire that spread, but maybe that's not replicable. Or is it really that they figured it out? Do they have an answer to how to do it?
When you look at these winning campaigns, they are not even all that similar in some cases in the tactics that they used. And some tactics we've seen, for example, work well at the Staten Island Amazon warehouse, like taking over a mandatory so-called captive audience meeting. And according to some organizers, backfire at an Apple store. And I think there is often a temptation to point to campaigns that won and assume they did everything right, and point to campaigns that lost and assume they did everything wrong. But sometimes even mediocre campaigns succeed because of outside circumstances, and sometimes very savvy, deliberate, strategic campaigns don't win. Because of some of the difficulties in organizing, often at the most powerful companies, it feels to workers and organizers like people win only if everything goes right, both in the things that are in their control and out of their control. I think, and I'm eager for your perspective and Dave's perspective on this, that what we've seen over the past couple of years is a combination of forces involving the radicalizing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the relatively more friendly regime at the NLRB, the tighter labor market, and also a different level of risk tolerance among some organizers who, like in the case of Starbucks, were open about saying, we don't need to win all of these elections. And the other thing we're seeing is the power of example. I talked to workers at all sorts of companies, all sorts of places in the country who saw what happened at Starbucks or at Amazon and then felt like organizing their own workplace was a live question in a way that it just hadn't seemed to be for a lot of people in the past.
Yeah. We've been talking about that in the context of the Teamsters negotiations. Dave, let me come to you. What would you say is the biggest, most important labor story right now? Or is there a meta story to be told about all of these stories, saying something about where workers are, a version of the latter part of what Josh was just saying?
Well, I agree with everything Josh had to say, but to go back to Seth, kind of you at the top, you rattled off a bunch of big stories that we're seeing now, not just organizing stories, but also, big contract fights. I think all of that stuff is very interrelated. I think something has kind of happened in the past 3 years. And look, I mean, every organizing campaign is different and there's very particular differences behind what led to them. But I think the pandemic has played a big role in all this. And I mean, you look at Amazon, it literally kind of the genesis, Chris Smalls on Staten Island leading a walkout related to COVID safety was kind of what got the ball rolling there on things. And it's been a common point among a lot of Starbucks workers, COVID safety as well. But more generally, I think the pandemic kind of helped rewire people's expectations about what they should have on a job, what kind of protections they should have, what sort of pay they should get, and generally, what their employers owe them. So, that, kind of, dovetailing with this, kind of freaky pandemic labor market we had, where we saw a lot of, leverage returning to workers, union and non-union alike. I think that's also, fed into this. So, with the tight labor market, I think it gives, workers kind of, more leverage to try to organize. It's literally harder to replace workers you may want to fire if they're organizing during a labor market like the one we've had. But I think it's also fed into the big contract fights we're seeing too. You mentioned the Teamsters UPS contract fight, which, I believe, and either, Josh, you can maybe, I don't know if you've looked into this, but the term I've seen is maybe the largest private sector strike at a single employer. And that seems to check out in the research I've been able to do. Unfortunately, there is no like totally reputable resource for looking that sort of thing up. But that is kind of like the scale of what we're talking about here. And I was actually at a happy hour recently for UPS drivers, and they were talking a lot. They got up and, people were kind of drinking beers and having pizza and talking about why they were in this fight. And a lot of them were talking about, look, I'm making good money now, but I kind of feel beaten down. I don't necessarily want the forced overtime. And for the long timers, there was a feeling that like over time since the 97 strike that things have not kept up with in terms of like the share that workers deserve from UPS. And so I think, all of that stuff is like very much that, it's not the same thing, but I think you can kind of draw a line between talk like that at union places, place like UPS, which has been union forever, and sort of some of the talk we're hearing at non-union places where workers are trying to organize, whether it's Amazon, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, Apple, or like a whole ton of places that nobody's heard of and get a lot less attention because people haven't heard of them. So I think for all of these reasons, it's like a very exciting time to be reporting on this sort of stuff. And I can say for myself, and I'm guessing is true for Josh too, is that seeing all this stuff come to the fore right now and seeing so much public interest in this sort of stuff, it's kind of given a lot of us who've been around a while, like an excuse to like really dig into the nitty gritty on stuff that we have for a while, but there hasn't like been that public interest now. And like, if you told me people would be writing about, the particulars of contract fights and the inner workings of campaigns, I would have been very surprised to learn that it's having sort of like the level of public interest that it has now. And so, a big, and this sort of, goes to what Josh is saying about the big story this year. Does this lead to concrete gains in contracts at places like Starbucks? I think more broadly is the question is like, does this lead to concrete changes, or is all of this sort of a temporary thing? Be it this burst in organizing we've seen, also the tight labor market, sort of like what comes out of it that's lasting? And I think we don't know the answers to that yet. And I think like there are probably reasons for unions and workers to be pessimistic when you look at some of the contract fights that are going on right now. Somewhere there's been like obviously like fairly little progress, but does the organizing stay there? And I think a lot of organizers would say they just looked at elections as more of like a tool than like sort of the end game, right? The end game was not necessarily to win a union election. Sometimes the union election is used to organize the workers and kind of build something there. So I think these are all sort of like really interesting questions that people are trying to unpack right now. And I think that the jury is still out on the answers.
Yeah. So I want to agree with both of you about the undercurrent. Maybe it's not even an undercurrent. I think, Dave, if you're hearing it at a beer and pizza party for UPS drivers, I've been hearing it from conversations with labor leaders and some of the workers that I communicate with at various channels. There was a trauma inflicted on a lot of workers during the COVID pandemic. And it reminds me of the experience my parents had during the Great Depression, where they never really recovered from the fear and the pain of the economic dislocation that occurred in their lives and their families' lives. They were just kids and teenagers during the Great Depression, but to their dying day, it was a defining element of their lives. Because the news cycle moves on from events like the COVID-19 pandemic, even though we sort of refer back to it periodically, we undervalue what the meaning of that event was for millions and millions and millions of workers, essential workers, workers who lost their jobs, workers who were exposed in a variety of ways, workers who have family members who were exposed or who were essential workers, or just ended up in some kind of economic disadvantage because of that. And I think there's a real brewing anger out there. But your points, both of you making this point that it's sort of hard to know how it's going to come out, is a critically important point. And we're in the organizing space. I think we're seeing a lot of activity where you have well-established, mature bargaining relationships like Teamsters and UPS. You're seeing progress made. You also saw that in other places like John Deere and Kaiser Permanente and others. But So I want to just, if you don't mind, I want to zoom in on Teamsters UPS because that's the issue of the literal moment, because there's news being made about it all the time. There may be news breaking about it right now. We're recording this Monday afternoon at about 2:00, and who knows what's going on between now and when we run this tomorrow. So I gave a quote to another reporter. I apologize. I have to tell you guys, I actually speak to other reporters. I'm sorry about that. And the quote ran this weekend. And it's the kind of quote that would have made the two of you pull your hair out. You never would have let me get away with it. So here was what I said. I said, talking about the Teamsters UPS negotiations where they both walked away from the table, I said, it could be that this is theater and both sides are trying to get the last possible advantage to squeeze out the last available dollar. Or it could be that they're at a genuine impasse where there's no overlap in their positions and they're trying to assess what to do. So I narrowed it down to all available possibilities in my brilliant analysis. That's what people call me for. So Dave, let me start with you and ask about this. What do you think is happening in the Teamster? I know you're not at the table and you're not one of those unfortunate reporters who's staking out the negotiations and sort of buttonholing people as they walk out the door. What do you think?
I get to leave that to the Bloomberg folks, fortunately.
There's an army of them. That's why they can spare cat. So is it labor theater 2023? Is that what we're seeing? Or is there a real breakdown in the talk? So that's my first question. The second is, what do you think is at stake in this Teamsters UPS negotiations? You mentioned largest private sector bargaining unit, possibly the largest strike in maybe ever in the private sector, at least a single employer. What should we be looking for as the story develops?
So sort of on the more granular level, all with the caveat that, as you said, I am not hanging out at the hotel grabbing negotiators as they walk out the door. But look, I don't think anyone, be it inside the Teamsters or in UPS headquarters, was surprised at where this breakdown of talks. I mean, the Teamsters essentially had kind of two deadlines here, right? There's the actual deadline at the end of this month when the current contract expires. They have vowed to go on strike if something is not in place beyond that. But as to what happened last week, they said they wanted a deal in place by the end of the July 4th holiday weekend. And there's good reason for that, right? This is a huge, complicated contract involving more than 300,000 workers. You don't want to be like kind of wrapping this up at the last minute and saying we've got a deal when your workers have not had the time to digest it and discuss it and vote on it. So the Teamsters want that time to do that. So they said they did not get to where they did. The UPS did not give them a satisfactory deal by when they needed one. So there a lot of finger pointing happened. But look, is it theater? Look, I don't think, as I said, I don't think anyone is surprised at where this ended up, and there is time to hash out a deal here. And I'll say, look, there's still the money thing is always it's always last and always the biggest thing. What are folks going to get paid? But I think the fact that they addressed the heat thing, right? They've came to terms on having all new trucks starting next year, having air conditioning in them to address this very serious and scary hazard of heat. They have a tentative agreement on that, and they've also reached one on eliminating this two-tier system known as the 22-4. That's a clause in the contract that allows for the sort of lower class of drivers who do all the stuff that more senior drivers do, but they earn less, and the drivers despise that. Understandably, it's been there. They want to get rid of it, and they've come to a tentative agreement on how to get rid of that. I think that's all really encouraging. So, you hear talks breaking down. We're running out of time. I would advise that there's also been some good news, right? So it's not a foregone conclusion that there's going to be a strike. That said, Sean O'Brien, the new Teamsters president, he ran on taking on UPS. This was what he was going to deliver was, claw back the concessions that have been made, stop the concessionary contracts and deliver something real and strong here. And so obviously there's a lot of pressure on him and the rest of leadership to really come home with a strong contract. So people always, at work, colleagues, they always want to know, is there going to be a strike? I don't know. I'm wrong about this half the time, so don't listen to what I have to say on whether there's going to be a strike. But for all the like kind of scary headlines about, talks breaking down, keep in mind sometimes parties involved want the headlines of talks breaking down. And there may be some good news behind it. There may be some progress. So we don't know what's going to happen. Anyone who tells you they knows what's going to happen is not, is full of it, I think.
Okay, well, so let me give Josh a chance to tell us if he knows what's going to happen. I don't want to miss the opportunity because Josh may actually know what's going to happen. Let's see. Josh, what do you think?
As usual, I would echo Dave's wise words and wise humility. And
so I'll take that as a no. You don't know what's going to happen, but I don't think anybody does. Let me narrow the question down a little bit for you. Go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
With all respect, if I found out what was going to happen, I might not be here having this conversation. As much as that would pain me, I think, as Dave says, there can be a rhythm to these things. There is time for negotiations to be dead and revived and dead and revived a lot of times in the next weeks, whether that's formal or informal or otherwise. But these are two sides that have some significant gap between them still, and on things that cost money. So, for example, the issue of part-time workers is important to the union because, as with the two-tier question, part of what the union wants to do is to create more of a sense that everybody is benefiting fairly from the work that they're doing, and that there's not, in one sense or another, a multiple tier system or a great contract that only some subset of the union members actually benefit from. But because there are a lot of part-time workers at UPS, it would cost UPS a lot of money to compensate part-time workers better. And it seems like UPS has been clever about finding ways to diffuse some of the hot button and high profile and sympathetic issues, but there is a significant gap there. And my sense is that within the union and within the labor movement, there has been a certain amount of back and forth on the proverbial needle as they try to calculate how likely a strike is to actually happen. I know one union leader reached out to Sean O'Brien a month or so ago to say, "Oh, I'm disappointed. It looks like you're not going to get to go on strike at UPS. I'm looking forward to that." And then more recently, after this breakdown in talks, I think within the union and outside of it, there has been at least some sense that a strike is now again more likely. But part of what's been striking, I think, about this is the unapologetic approach that the union has taken to talking about going on strike and setting a deadline for a strike. I once saw a union button that said, "I don't want to strike, but I will." This was a different union. And a member who was wearing the button crossed out the "I don't want to strike" part because they did want to strike. They were eager for it. And it was quite something at the Labor Notes conference to see the cheering last summer at the declaration that the Teamsters would go on strike, which was such eager cheering that it came before the end of the sentence, which was, "unless they get a good contract at UPS first by the deadline." I think Sean O'Brien has made a decision to not approach this with a theatrical reluctance about going on strike, and instead to go around, make the rounds, be seemingly more visible sometimes than the UPS CEO, saying, "Of course we're going to go on strike if we don't get what we deserve." And so far, there does not seem to have been a great public backlash against that. We'll see what unfolds as we get closer. I would also just add that this is a test, along with a test for the company, a test for the labor movement. It's also a test for the Shawns, by which I mean both the Teamsters and the UAW have new leaders who, whether they were running against an incumbent or an heir apparent, came out of a faction that was opposed to the prior leadership of the union and was arguing that they could win more and build a stronger union. And that's an additional reason beyond the other ones that there's a lot of pressure on the Teamsters now.
Yeah, and there's no question in my mind that the UAW leadership is watching these Teamsters UPS negotiations very closely. And I'm quite confident that the folks in the Teamsters, while they're tightly focused on their UPS members, have a corner of their eye focused on the Amazon workers and the expected effect of whatever is the outcome of the Teamsters UPS negotiations on their efforts to organize at Amazon. You know, Sean O'Brien stood up an Amazon division inside the union. That was not because he had so many members at Amazon that he needed a group to manage them or to service them. It's because he wants to go organize those workers. I think it's going to be a very telling outcome here. And well, maybe I will ask you. Let me ask you this. I'll ask both of you this. Josh, let me start with you. From a perspective of turning bargaining success into organizing success, are the Teamsters better off with a strike or without a strike?
Again, I'll dodge the A or B and say it depends on the strike and the ultimate outcome. If there's a story to tell that's credible about the company being unwilling to make some major concessions, and then a strike that galvanizes people and the public and then forces the company to move more and engages more leaders, then that's potentially more galvanizing for people than winning without a strike. But often there are strikes in whatever industry, and the end result is something that there's some disagreement within the union and outside the union over, on the question of whether people ultimately won the thing that they went out on strike for. I think if the Teamsters win the things that they're demanding without going on strike, it will be a very easy thing to say, we won this because we were ready to go on strike. And if they don't get those things, even after going on strike, then that will be a talking point for people against not just this union, but all sorts of other unions.
Yeah, I think that's right. Dave, what do you think?
Yeah, you know, people on Twitter like to say when we strike, we win, or strikes get the goods. And I say when you strike, you win sometimes. Other times you lose. Sometimes it's hard to tell if you won. Maybe you got the goods, maybe you didn't. So it does, like Josh said, I think it all hinges on how a strike plays out and whether that, you know, clearly delivers something tangible. I think, like, you know, you look at something like the John Deere strike, and it's hard to call that, I think, anything other than a win for the union. I mean, they came up with something demonstrably better than they would have otherwise. You know, as far as, Seth, what you had said about you know, how this could affect organizing elsewhere at places like Amazon for the Teamsters, I think the contract affects not just the Teamsters and organizing, but also just like broadly, you know, working conditions in this huge sprawling logistics sector that we have, right? I mean, UPS as a union shop can sort of like set a marker for expectations elsewhere. If pay goes up a lot at UPS, you know, Amazon has to pay more if they want to attract people to their, you know, generally non-union workplace. So this contract, it's huge, and it has huge implications, you know, not just within the Teamsters and unions more broadly, but within really an entire sector of the economy. And I think if there is a strike, one interesting facet of this particular battle is, I think we've seen over the last couple of years, by and large, and, you know, I think there's a lot of support for strikers in most cases. I think the general public generally pulls for them. I mean, of course, anti-union people are generally not going to, but when you consider the general approval ratings of unions and sort of how people have reacted to large strikes the last couple of years, I think a lot of support is there. But in this case, you're going to have you know, you would have that running into a very, you know, volatile consumer situation, right? Writer's strike, we're still, you're, as a consumer, a viewer, you're really still not seeing the effects yet of a writer's strike. There's a real,
That's right.
lag time to it. It's a while before your shows aren't showing up and movies aren't getting made. But if UPS goes on strike next week, you're not getting certain packages, right? It's going to affect small businesses, large businesses, and it's going to affect regular people on sort of the speed of their packages in this world where we expect like freaky fast delivery, like at all times. It's kind of insane when we expect to get the stuff we buy online. So how will a strike impact that? And will people be, less enthusiastic about a strike by workers who are bringing them their goods? That all kind of remains to be seen. And, we don't, like, as I said, and Josh as well, you don't want to make predictions on this sort of thing. I think I would be a little surprised if there was a prolonged strike, though. I will say that. I mean, if I had to bet on it, if there was a strike, I think it would be on the shorter side. But bookmark me saying that, because I'm ready to be like totally wrong when we come back to this, in week 9 of a UPS strike.
Yeah. Well, Dane, our producer, is going to clip that. Yeah. And depending upon how it comes out, it'll either be on a continuous loop on social media or we're just going to put it in the library. I'm not going to tell you which one is going to come out. Okay, let me turn to a new subject.
Soundtrack also.
Exactly. That's right. And we may actually superimpose somebody else's face on Dave's, but that's a whole other thing. All right, let me turn to the United States Supreme Court. And if you listen carefully, you can hear our viewers booing and hissing right now, because not the most popular institution in American life. But they've issued some decisions recently that are going to have some lasting consequences for workers. And I'll just mention 3 of them. The first is Glacier Northwest versus Teamsters, which we are both familiar with, in which the court held that a union could be sued in state court for property damages that allegedly flowed from a strike. In essence, what the court held was that lawsuit is not preempted by the National Labor Relations Act. That's the formal term that lawyers use to say that you can still go forward with a state action because it doesn't interfere with the federal law. We had a decision, a very famous decision, in a case called Students for Fair Admissions versus University of North Carolina, in a separate case against Harvard, in which the court held that it violated both the Constitution and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to use race in college admissions decision-making. And then there was 303 Creative LLC versus Olenis, where the majority ruled that the First Amendment gives a web designer the right to refuse service to a same-sex couple, whether that same-sex couple is fictional or real, apparently, even though there was a state law involved that banned discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. So the affirmative action case and the 303 Creative case were not about labor law, labor relations directly, but all of these decisions are going to have meaningful consequences for workers. So, Dave, let me start with you on this. In your conversations with folks in labor, what's their reaction to the Supreme Court making these two of these decisions are really quite monumental? I think the Glacier Northwest decision is important, but not earth-shattering, right? It could have been much worse, is my take on it. And I've written about this, and we did a blogcast about it. But when you talk to the folks in labor, what is their sense of what the long-term implications are going to be for workers, and which of the decisions are they most worried about?
So, well, I think even setting aside, what impact would say the gay rights case or the affirmative action case, what sort of remains to be seen, what impact that could directly have in a workplace setting, right? But obviously organized labor is sort of part of a broader, progressive coalition now. And those are issues, that are very important to them. So I think, understandably and without surprise, they were very upset about those decisions. I think another, concerning factor is obviously you take the rationales that were in those cases and they could be applied to many workplace cases that may land before the court. Glacier Northwest is kind of a different animal. I think a lot of people think it was a little narrower than maybe than other people cast the decision. And it can, how narrow will its application be? Will it just be sort of, strikes where there's perishable goods in question, that sort of thing. This case involved, concrete that hardened, immediately during a strike. Sort of the broader takeaway, though, I think, is like basically it's hard to see this court with the Republican supermajority really bringing anything but bad news for unions in union related cases that come up, and more generally worker rights cases. There are going to be outliers where sort of they come down, wherever the AFL-CIO is on it. But I think it's as long as that supermajority there, it's going to be one rough ruling after another for the most part. And you can look at recent landmark ones, not just for unions. Obviously Janus case, which has presumably hurt public sector unions. Is going to be some time before we really see how that's played out. But other cases,
let me just for the people who are not familiar with it, Janus is the decision of the Supreme Court several years ago, Janus versus the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, where the Supreme Court essentially held that all of state and local government, public sector unionism is now right to work, right? Is that you can't require anyone to pay agency fees to support a union. I think I got that right, but but certainly it was a big threat to the public sector unions.
So as far as union specific cases, it's hard to see anything but mostly bad news. But then you look more broadly, you take something like, cases where the conservative court has chipped away kind of generally, not union specific, but, saying it's okay to have forced arbitration in the workplace. So decisions like that, where this court is generally going to come down on the side of corporations and generally kind of chip away at workers' bargaining power. So I think that is like that is or should be the driving concern for unions, not just cases that may hurt unions, but cases that undermine worker leverage more generally. And with the kind of the makeup of this court, it's hard to see anything but for quite some time.
So Josh, what in your conversations with folks in the labor movement, and I know both of you talk to labor leaders and labor staff and labor lawyers very frequently, what is your sense of how the labor movement sees this moment in dealing with the Supreme Court? I think Dave is exactly right, is that really no one wants to see a labor case go to the United States Supreme Court if they can avoid it. In fact, I had heard that there were some discussions about trying to get the Glacier Northwest case settled if there was any way to do that, although that didn't end up happening, and it didn't end up coming out quite as badly, I think, as folks had feared it would. The court could have really undermined the right to strike in that decision if they had wanted to. But is the labor movement's perspective on the Supreme Court now is not just stay away, but that they're going to use it as part of a larger political organizing strategy or even a worker organizing strategy to make the case that you can't rely on the law. You really have to rely on coming together with your coworkers to organize. That's the only way you can protect yourself.
Well, again, I would echo much of what Dave said. I would say part of what's interesting about Glacier is uncertainty in general freaks unions out. And one of the differences between a union that's recognized by the government and the employer versus a group of activists is that a union has certain legal liabilities that even the threat of getting in trouble can change behavior a whole lot. We saw this with longshore workers on the West Coast who were accused of blocking movement of goods and ended up having Occupy activists, in a sense, step in and replace them doing activism once the union was in a position of not wanting to endorse it. And with Glacier, while it was a narrower holding than some people were concerned about, it's also one that some labor advocates and experts see as an invitation, particularly to state governments, to further push the boundary. We've seen over the past decade or so more aggressive, bold moves by Republicans in states where they had a trifecta to go after unions than by Democrats in trifecta blue states. And if a state takes Glacier and runs with it to try to perhaps create another case for the Supreme Court or interpret what the justices are allowing in a way particularly ominous for unions, then that could affect unions' behavior regardless. I think in terms of what we hear from organized labor leadership, there has not yet been a full-throated attack on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court in the way that you might hear from some labor activists or some workers. There has not been so far full-throated, say, calls from organized labor to expand or to reimagine the Supreme Court. There has still been a fair amount of trying to color within the lines of the existing system while decrying particular decisions. And there are strategies to weigh in what might make the most sense there. But much like Democrats in the Senate, you've mainly seen prominent...
And the what you just described is also the president's position, yeah.
Yeah, you've mainly seen union leaders warning that things could be bad for the fairness and or legitimacy of the Supreme Court, rather than treating it as a hostile or illegitimate institution the way that some people might feel or like, or some people saying certain things publicly might privately already feel. The Supreme Court also is there looming when we talk about the NLRB, of course. And
sure,
Jennifer Abruzzo, as general counsel, has thrilled a lot of labor activists, a bunch of labor leaders, by taking a maximalist view on what the existing statute allows her to do. But there are people within labor and lawyers in the labor movement who have some heartburn about the question of whether cases are being teed up that eventually will reach the Supreme Court and will not go well. And we have seen companies like Amazon signal that they're interested in appealing all the way to the end of the road at the Supreme Court. And if there is new law made in the process, then a number of management attorneys may see that as an added benefit of that strategy. Now, when I've asked Abruzzo, the general counsel, about this, what she said is it's her obligation to enforce the law, and that judges don't always understand labor law that well, which is unfortunate, but that she and her team are doing their best to educate them about it.
Yeah, there are no labor courts in the United States. And as a consequence, you have judges who might have been prosecutors their entire lives, professional lives, making some of these decisions, and they don't always come out well. And I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt when I say that. Okay, so let me close with this question. And I'm not asking you to disclose any confidences here. I don't want you to, Josh, I'm not asking you to show Dave your notebook with what you're working on. Dave, I am asking you to show the public your notebook. But here's the question, and that is what, and you just a few sentences on for both of you on this goes, but if you want to go further, you can go further. You can tantalize a little bit, sort of preview what we should be looking for in the HuffPost and in Bloomberg, all the various Bloomberg outlets, Josh, that you're covered in. So what is the next big story that we're going to be talking about in 2024 that we are next big labor story? Let me narrow it down a little bit for you. What's the next big labor story that we're going to be talking about in 2024 that we are not talking about in 2023? Josh, let you start with that.
not speaking to my own reporting, but I think in this moment, with everything else that's been going on, it will be interesting to see what happens at Walmart, a company that used to be the lightning rod that everyone was talking about in terms of working conditions, in terms of organizing efforts, traditional or otherwise. Walmart has taken steps to distinguish itself from some of its competitors to, without conceding power, spend money to address some of the things that it was being criticized for. Meanwhile, in the zeitgeist, there's been a lot more conversation about Amazon as the place that tells us what it's like to work in America than Walmart. But Walmart is still the biggest private employer in the United States. There continue to be some efforts to raise issues there, though not any public formal unionization efforts beyond one involving a handful of employees. And it's going to be interesting to see what's ahead there.
Interesting. Dave, 2024, stuff we're not talking about now.
Well, there's big L labor stories and small L labor stories. I think the small L one, the big one, obviously, is does the Fed induce a recession, with the rate hikes, and do we see tons of people thrown out of work, and what impact will that have not just on the labor market but on bargaining power generally at work, union and non-union alike. As we were saying, earlier, it's been a tight labor market that has given people a lot of power to negotiate, not just in contracts, but on stuff like, work from home and all kinds of things, as we've reoriented our expectations about, what an employer should provide. If the labor market really slackens, then, I think we'll probably see employers taking stuff away. We will see smaller wage increases. We're going to see some of these accommodations that have been made, they'll start to pull some of them back. So I think, that is a big, the really a pressing economic story on the big level. As far as big L labor, I think as Josh had said earlier, and this is going to become a more pressing story as the months go on, is sort of what sort of gains have some of these campaigns delivered, right? We're now well over a year into some of the big marquee unionization efforts at Amazon and Starbucks. As time goes on, are we seeing contracts yet? It's only going to get more difficult over time. And I think, the more time that elapses, more workers wonder how much this can deliver stuff. And so I think that is, and of course, it's a big story now, but I think it kind of becomes more pressing as the clock goes on. And so those are a couple areas where I think, are going to be, big stories in the coming months and next year.
Do you think that if there are no contracts that we're going to end up with very big strikes at some of these places?
We could, that all depends on, there's the contracts, but then there's the organizing, does the organizing continue? Can they increase some density at different facilities? And the Starbucks organizing, I think, has objectively slowed a bit. It may have picked back up, but it's not at the pace that it was last year. So what does that mean if they want to continue doing strikes over contract negotiations? So there's all of these kind of unsettled questions of what power these, after these big wins, how much power do they have if employers are really holding back and on contracts?
And there's a contrast, of course.
Oh. Go ahead, Josh.
Between
I'm sorry.
Starbucks and UPS, or between the longshore workers, for example, and Trader Joe's workers, in terms of there are strikes that primarily exist to force movement by the company because of how they impact revenue immediately. And then there are strikes that mainly exist as galvanizing events and public pressure events and strikes that target a company's brand. And if you are an organizer or a worker somewhere trying to exercise leverage, it does help to be able to pull off a strike that will immediately hurt the company's bottom line rather than only call attention to something, especially because as you do more strikes to call attention, it becomes harder to get that attention through that strike tactic.
Yeah, I think we may be at the beginnings of seeing that with respect to the Starbucks campaign. Certainly, the Amazon campaign. There hasn't been a lot of coverage of that lately. And you're right. The Workers United has 300 some odd stores organized now out of how many thousands in the United States?
9,000 corporate.
Yeah, it's not. It may not. A strike may not be the right tactic, and that's going to be a hard choice for them to make. Well, I knew that if I had two of the heaviest hitters in labor reporting on, we would learn a lot. It would be a lot of fun, and we would have a bunch of viral video that we could send around the internet, and we have all of that. So, gents, I really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having us, Seth. We appreciate
Great.
it.
Thank you. So you may have noticed during the blogcast that Josh had to turn his computer off. He actually had to change rooms. He had to leave the room that he was in when he was meeting with us at first and find another conference room in which he could finish the blogcast. So that's real dedication. People are putting in the extra mile, right? They're putting in the extra effort. They're doing the extra lifting they need to be a part of the Power at Work blogcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was really fascinating. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from these reporters, and not just these reporters, but all of the reporters that we follow here at the Power at Work blog. They're doing really terrific work, talking to workers, talking to organizers, talking to people at the bargaining table. I've been actually talking to some of the reporters who are staking out the UPS-Teamsters negotiations, but they're also talking to labor leaders. They're talking to people at the AFL-CIO and SEIU and some of the other major unions that are outside the AFL, the Teamsters and others. So you should go the extra mile and subscribe to the Power at Work blog. You can do that right on the homepage. If you do that, we will send you the weekly download, which is an amalgamation of a couple of dozen pieces of great reporting by our guests today, but also other reporters, including the reporters who were on the first Labor Reporters Roundtable that we had several weeks ago. By the way, go back and watch that on the Power at Work blog. But if you'll get the weekly download in your inbox if you subscribe, and you'll get all this great information, articles, interviews, think pieces, scholarly works, whatever it is that we're able to find on the internet that we think that you're going to find interesting, that we think is important. The weekly download is also posted on the blog, and it's also posted on our LinkedIn Power at Work blog page. So you can find it in a lot of different places, but why not let us send it to you? Let us send it to you so that you're reminded of it and you can click on some of these great links, read some of these great stories, and stay up to date on what's going on in labor world. There's a lot. I mean, that was actually how I started this blogcast. You heard me say it. There's a lot going on. You can keep up with it both here on the Power Work blog with the weekly download and by following us on social media. So I hope you'll do that. Send us your blogcast ideas. We want to hear them. We're eager to give you the information that you'd like to have. Let me say thank you again for your support of the Power at Work blog, and we will see you right here on the blog again very soon. Thanks.